Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ghost and the Twins by Bobby Holmes, also known as Anna J. McIntyre. Narrated by Romy Nordlinger. 1. Homer stood in the far corner of the ER patient room and watched the nurse hook the unconscious man up to monitors. When the nurse had inserted the IV minutes earlier, Homer looked away. He could never stomach the sight of needles puncturing flesh. "How is he?" Flora asked from the open doorway. Flora, a plain-looking, middle-aged woman, was, in Homer's opinion, responsible for this mess. If she had just completed the DNR, instead of the nurse wasting her time on the patient, he might be at the funeral home. After all, without medical intervention, how long could he last? "The same. We hope to move him to his own hospital room within the hour. Did you contact the family?" the nurse asked. "It's just 2 nieces and a nephew. But no, I haven't been able to reach them yet. But I left messages." "I don't see any of them rushing to their dear uncle's side," Homer grumbled. If Flora heard Homer's comment, she didn't respond. The nurse turned from the monitors to the hospital bed and studied the unconscious patient. His breathing labored. "How long have you been his caretaker?" "About 6 years. It was a few months after they diagnosed him with Alzheimer's." "And he doesn't have family in Frederickport? No one?" Flora shook her head. "No, his one niece, Camilla, used to live here. She's the one who arranged for me to take care of him." The nurse looked from her patient to Flora. "Does she visit often?" Homer laughed at the question, while Flora said, "To be honest, I only met her that one time when she hired me. Of course, we talk on the phone periodically. I've never met her brother or sister, but I have their numbers as contacts, and I have spoken to them on the phone." The nurse shrugged. "That's sad. I've seen that happen many times before. Family members stop visiting when the Alzheimer's patient no longer remembers them." "To be honest, they never visited, even back when he might have still remembered them. But the niece who hired me, her ex-husband used to come see him every week." "That's nice." "I thought so. The niece, the one who hired me, she left town a couple of years before I met her. But her ex was fond of her uncle, and he'd visit him for a few hours each week, and they'd play cribbage. But after a year, well, the Alzheimer's worsened, and he no longer understood how to play the game, and eventually he no longer recognized his cribbage partner. Unfortunately, visits after that upset Mr. Carter, so I suggested it be best if he stopped coming." "Does he still live in Frederickport?" "Yes, in fact, he's a police officer in town." "Oh, perhaps I should call him. He might know another way to contact the family." The only way Danielle could fit comfortably in the booth at Pier Cafe was to shove the table toward Brian and Heather's side, giving her growing belly more room. She found it difficult to get comfortable no matter where she sat these days. Instead of weaving her long brown hair into a fishtail braid that morning, Danielle had pulled her hair into a quick ponytail. She did not have the energy to fuss with her hair. These days, her normal wardrobe included stretch pants and oversized blouses or T-shirts. Next to her in the booth sat her husband, Walt, whose attire was far more put together than hers. Today he wore gray slacks and a gray and white striped dress shirt, its top button unfastened. "Are you sure you're only 7 months pregnant?" Heather asked as she popped a French fry in her mouth. A few years younger than Danielle, and considerably younger than her boyfriend, Brian Henderson, Heather wore her long jet-black hair free, falling past her bare shoulders. Heather referred to the long dress she wore as a sundress, which Brian found amusing, considering its color matched her hair. Danielle glanced down at her belly and then looked back at Heather with a sigh. Almost 8 months. Twins usually come early, Heather chirped. She grabbed another French fry. Brian let out a snort and shook his head. Are you picking on Danielle? Danielle chuckled. Actually, I'm okay with them coming early, as long as they're both healthy. Well, if they come early and you can't get to the hospital in time, Brian can always help if he's here, Heather said. Danielle arched her brows. Brian? Sure, he's delivered babies before. Sometimes cops have to. Brian chuckled. I doubt Danielle wants me to deliver her babies. I'm sure she'll get to the hospital in time. Danielle cringed. Yeah, that would be rather awkward. Have you really had to deliver a baby when on the job? Walt asked. Brian nodded. Twice. They chatted a few minutes more about Brian's experiences delivering babies before shifting the conversation to their friend Lily and Lily's pregnancy. I'm surprised Laura's not sticking around until Lily has her baby. It's only 4 more months, Heather said. Laura, Lily's sister, had been staying at Marlowe House with Walt and Danielle across the street from Lily and Ian's house. Noticing Danielle's cringe in response to Heather's comment, Brian laughed before saying, Is that house guest beginning to smell like fish? Danielle shrugged. It's not that. But, well, it will be nice to have our house back, especially now. After all, Heather is right. These babies could come early. I'd rather we have everything set up and no house guest. Heather gave a nod. True, and it's not like she can stay with her sister. They have the house torn up with the addition. Didn't I hear something about Lily and Ian moving into Marlowe House while they add on to their house? Brian asked. Oh, we made the offer, Walt said, but they decided they really didn't need to. And I think Lily felt a little funny with Laura staying with us for so long. She mentioned how Walt and I need time alone before the babies arrive, Danielle said. When does she leave for Europe? Brian asked. Danielle looked at Brian. She flies to New York on Wednesday. I still can't believe Charlie Kramer was in town all that time, getting chummy with Laura. Heather cringed at the thought. It about got her killed, Danielle said. Heather leaned forward, placed her elbows on the tabletop, and rested her chin on her right palm. What really annoys me, right after they arrested Kramer, he confessed to the murders, but then his attorney got the confession tossed out. So instead of going straight to prison, he's in a jail waiting for trial. If he hadn't been in that jail, he probably wouldn't have escaped, and he wouldn't have come here and terrorized Danielle and Laura. And he would still be alive, Brian reminded her. Heather smiled at him. You always know how to make me feel better. She leaned over and gave him a quick kiss. Before Brian could respond, his cell phone rang. He picked up the cell phone and looked to see who was calling. He frowned and answered the phone. Flora? Walt, Danielle, and Heather quietly ate their lunch while Brian talked on his cell phone. After Brian ended the call a few minutes later, he set the cell phone on the table. Is everything okay? Heather asked. Remember when I told you about my friend Carter who has Alzheimer's? Brian asked. He then looked across the table to Walt and Danielle. He's also my ex-wife's uncle. Carter and I go back a long way. In fact, I knew him before I met my second wife. He lives in Frederickport and has Alzheimer's. Brian looked back at Heather and said, That was his caretaker. Carter had a heart attack, and he's in the hospital. Laura's been trying to get a hold of Camilla and her brother and sister. Brian looked back at Walt and Danielle and added, That's the only family Carter has. When Flora couldn't get a hold of them, she called me. Well, what does she want you to do? Does she think you can get a hold of Camilla? Heather asked. Brian shrugged. She thought I might have another number for them. I don't. How's he doing? Walt asked. Not well. Flora says he may not make it through the night. I hate the idea of Carter dying alone. Why don't you go see him? Heather said. Brian considered Heather's suggestion a moment before saying, I think I should. He looked back at Walt and Danielle. Like I said, Carter and I go back a long way. He was always a character. I really liked him. After Camilla and I split and she left town, I visited him once a week. We'd play cribbage. But that pissed off his ex, Heather told Walt and Danielle. Brian flashed Heather a smile, looked back to Walt and Danielle, and continued. It did. Carter mentioned something to Camilla about our weekly cribbage games. Camilla called and reminded me Carter was her uncle, and I needed to find someone else to play cribbage with. Why did she care? Danielle asked. Carter doesn't have a family aside from my ex-wife and her brother and sister. He has some money and a house that's paid for. I know he set up a trust back when Camilla and I were married, dividing the estate between Camilla and her two siblings, with her as the trustee. From what Flora has told me, Camilla hasn't been back since she arranged for Carter's care. Flora's never met Camilla's brother or sister. Carter wasn't happy when she divorced me. He was the one who introduced us. Camilla was worried Brian would end up inheriting her uncle's estate, Heather interjected. Brian gave Heather's comment a nod and looked back at Walt and Danielle. That's pretty much what Carter and I thought. You discussed it with him? Walt asked. Yes, when I told him about her phone call. So you continued seeing him? Danielle asked. Yes, on Camilla's next phone call to her uncle, he brought up the subject. He reminded her we were friends before she ever met me. He told her he didn't appreciate her interfering with his life. Camilla never called me again about it. I think she was afraid to. I imagine after that call she probably realized it wasn't the smartest thing to say. Carter didn't like to be told what to do. I'm assuming the Alzheimer's stopped the cribbage games? Danielle asked. Brian nodded. A little over 6 years ago, I noticed there was a problem. I called Camilla. I thought she should know. Like I said, after our divorce, she had left town and never returned, not even to visit her uncle. But she called him every week. I'll give her that. Brian picked up his iced tea and took a sip. After I called her, she came back to town and arranged care for her uncle. How long had she been gone at this point? Danielle asked. About 4 years. Brian set his glass of iced tea back on the table. Anyway, before Camilla arrived, I convinced Carter to go to his doctor. A year later, Carter had no clue who I was. After lunch, Brian decided to visit Carter. Heather sat quietly in the passenger seat as Brian drove them to the hospital. She had offered to go with him. Brian had accepted the offer, rather liking the idea of a chance to talk to Carter again, through Heather, if he passed when they were at the hospital. 15 minutes later, they were on the second floor of the Frederickport Hospital. Before leaving Pier Cafe, Flora had called Brian a second time, telling him Camilla's uncle had moved to room 210. As Brian and Heather walked down the hallway toward room 210, Heather stopped abruptly when an elderly man exited the room. The fact he had moved through the door without opening it gave her pause. Brian, preoccupied with his own thoughts, failed to notice Heather trailing behind him. Just as Heather caught up to him, the old man looked at Brian and shouted, "Brian, you came!" The next moment, Brian walked through the old man and opened the door to room 210. The old man vanished. 2. Uncle Carter is dead, Heather told herself as she quietly followed Brian into the hospital room. She wanted to grab him before he stepped inside room 210, but he had been too quick and had already opened the door and stepped inside before she could do anything. Plus, voices came from inside the room. Heather soon discovered the voices belonged to a doctor and a woman later introduced as Carter's caretaker. "You came." Flora sounded relieved as she greeted Brian, giving him an awkward hug. Both she and the doctor stood with their backs to the hospital bed, with the doctor scribbling notes on a piece of paper affixed to a clipboard. Heather ignored the inquiring frown Flora gave her before the caregiver turned her attention back to Brian. Heather glanced over to the hospital bed, where Carter's body remained, his face turned from view. "Of course I came, and I'd like you to meet my friend Heather Donovan." Brian reached out and grabbed hold of Heather's right hand, pulling her closer to him. "Heather, this is Flora Bennett, Carter's caregiver." Flora smiled weakly in Heather's direction, gave an unconvincing, "Nice to meet you," and turned back to Brian and said, "This is Dr. Morgan." Heather said nothing, feeling awkward since Brian proceeded as if Carter still lived. She waited for them to tell Brian. Dr. Morgan glanced up from his clipboard and gave Brian a smile. "I've met Officer Henderson before." "How's he doing?" Brian asked the doctor. "He's dead, that's how he's doing," Heather silently answered. Normally, Heather would find those words harsh when talking about someone Brian so clearly cared about. But Heather understood Carter was not only old, but Alzheimer's had trapped him inside his body for over 6 years. Moving over to the other side and starting the next leg of his journey would be a relief, in her opinion. "His vitals are good," the doctor said. Heather jerked her head around and looked at the doctor, whose attention was focused on Brian. She looked back over at the bed with Carter and then at the monitors. Action on the monitors confirmed the doctor's claims. While Brian talked to Flora and the doctor, Heather slowly walked toward the hospital bed. The three did not seem to notice her departure from Brian's side and her sudden interest in the patient. "If he's alive, who is the ghost who greeted us at the door?" Heather asked herself. He obviously knew Brian, but that's no biggie. Everyone in town seems to know Brian, even the doctor. I wonder, is our ghost newly departed? Is his body still in the hospital? Or has he been haunting these halls for years? Heather inched her way to the hospital bed as the questions ran through her head. When she reached Carter's bedside, she moved over to the other side of the bed to get a better look at his face. To her surprise, the man sleeping in the bed looked just like the ghost who had greeted Brian in the hallway. "Holy crap," Heather muttered. She looked up from the bed and glanced around the room. Carter is obviously having an out-of-body experience. Is he in a coma like Lily and Chris were? Where did he go? A few minutes later, the doctor left the room, leaving just Flora and Brian chatting amongst themselves. Silently, Heather returned to Brian's side. A sound from the bed interrupted the discussion. The three turned to the hospital bed in time to see Uncle Carter open his eyes and look around the room in confusion. Both Flora and Brian moved to his bedside. "Mr. Carter?" Flora asked as she took his hand. He looked at her and blinked several times before asking, "Where am I?" "I guess his spirit jumped back into his body," Heather told herself. "No reason to search the hospital for him after we leave." "You're in the hospital? You got a little sick, and they're taking good care of you here," Flora explained. Brian moved next to Flora and smiled down at the elderly man. "Hello, Carter. How are you feeling?" Carter frowned.
Who are you?
Brian smiled sadly.
My name's Brian. Brian Henderson. Do I know you? You did once. We used to play cribbage together, once a week. I used to play cribbage with my dad. You're not my dad.
Carter looked at Flora.
Where is my dad?
He's with your mom. You'll see him later, Flora told him. Carter considered Flora's words a moment and then looked at Heather, who stood to one side of Brian.
Who are you? Have we met? This is Heather. You've never met her before,
Brian explained. Carter looked from Heather to Brian and asked,
Is she your daughter?
Heather grinned while Flora let out a snort. Ignoring Flora's reaction, Heather stepped closer to Carter and said, It's nice to meet you, Mr. Carter. No, I'm not Brian's daughter, just a friend. And he was worried about you, so I offered to come with him to check on you. I hope you're feeling better.
I don't remember him,
Carter said, as he glanced from Heather to Brian, back to Heather.
You're pretty. I'd remember you.
Just as Heather flashed Carter a grin, a raspy voice called out,
Criminy, old man, she's young enough to be your granddaughter.
Heather, being the only one in the room who heard, looked up from Carter to find the ghost she had seen earlier standing by the hospital window, looking their way. Confused, she glanced from the ghost to Carter. They looked like twins. Did Carter have a twin? One who passed before his brother? Heather wondered. While thoughts ricocheted around in Heather's brain, Brian and Flora chatted with a confused Carter.
I don't remember you,
Carter once again told Brian.
It's Brian, you idiot, the ghost shouted. I swear, watching you like this drives me crazy.
The ghost turned to Flora and said,
It's all your fault. If you had simply gotten the DNR, I don't believe we'd all be here right now. I can't move on as long as he's sitting in that damn hospital bed sounding like an idiot.
Distracted by the ranting ghost, Heather found it impossible to follow Brian and Flora's conversation. A moment later, Carter closed his eyes and fell back to sleep. Flora and Brian moved away from the hospital bed to discuss the patient. While Brian and Flora quietly chatted, Heather silently moved toward the window and the still ranting ghost. Heather stood in front of the window. If Brian or Flora looked her way, they would assume she was looking outside. She stared at the ghost, who could not ignore the woman now standing inches from him, looking into his eyes. He frowned.
You can see me.
Heather nodded.
Who are you? He asked. What are you to Brian?
I'm his girlfriend, Heather whispered. Who are you? The ghost's eyes widened.
His girlfriend?
The ghost looked from Heather to Brian, who stood on the other side of the room, still talking to Flora. He looked back at Heather.
How old are you?
Heather flashed the ghost a scowl. Old enough.
Does Camilla know about you?
The ghost asked. He's no longer married to Camilla. They haven't been married for years.
I know that, the ghost snapped. But does Camilla know about you?
I doubt it. He hasn't seen her for years, Heather whispered.
I'd like to be there when she sees you, the ghost chuckled. She didn't treat Brian right. Broke his heart. Don't break his heart.
Who are you? Heather asked. The ghost glanced at the hospital bed and then back to Heather.
Seriously, you don't know?
I assume you're Carter's twin brother who passed before him. I'm just surprised Brian never mentioned he was a twin. The ghost laughed and then said,
I'm Homer. Homer Carter.
The next minute, he disappeared. Heather glanced around and turned from the window. "Thanks again for coming," Heather heard Flora say when she returned to Brian's side. "While you're technically not family, Mr. Carter always called you family, and frankly, in his current condition, I think he deserves to have family with him." "I'm sure Camilla will call you back. Maybe she went away for the weekend, and her phone doesn't have service," Brian suggested. "I also called her brother and sister. They haven't called me back." "In fairness to them, they probably expect Camilla to handle it and assume she'll be calling you. When you left a message, did you tell them you've been trying to contact Camilla?" Flora nodded. "Yes." "If you don't hear from Camilla by tomorrow, call me. I'll try to get a hold of her brother. We always got along well." They chatted a few more minutes while Heather silently listened, eager for Brian to say goodbye to Flora so she could ask him about Homer Carter. 10 minutes later, Brian and Heather were finally alone as they walked down the hallway toward the elevator. "Who is Homer Carter?" Brian glanced at Heather and frowned. You just met him." They stopped in front of the elevator, and Brian pushed the button. The elevator door opened. It was empty. As they stepped inside, Heather asked, "Was that a question or a statement?" Now, standing in the elevator, Brian glanced at Heather as the elevator door closed. "What are you talking about?" "Who is Homer Carter?" Brian frowned at Heather. "He's my ex-wife's uncle. You just met him." The elevator stopped. The door opened, and Brian stepped out onto the first floor. Heather remained standing in the elevator, a confused look on her face. When Brian realized Heather hadn't moved out of the elevator, he turned to face her. "What's wrong?" Brian asked. The elevator door started to close. Brian moved his hand between the doors. The doors opened. Zombie-like, Heather stepped from the elevator. "Heather, what's going on?" "I'm so confused." Heather took Brian's right hand. "We need to go somewhere private to talk." 30 minutes later, Brian and Heather sat in Brian's car, still parked in the hospital parking lot. Heather had finished telling Brian about her encounter with the ghost. After answering a series of questions Brian asked, they now sat quietly, rethinking their conversation. Finally, Brian said, "I don't understand." Heather shrugged. "I don't either. If the dude in the bed had been sleeping while the ghost ranted, I would assume he was simply having an out-of-body experience." "I have to say, being with you is never boring." Brian let out a sigh. "Now what?" "Now we talk to Eva. If anyone knows what just happened, she will." 3. It was the first Saturday of April. After saying goodbye to Heather and Brian at Pier Cafe, Walt had driven Danielle to the grocery store in the Ford Flex. Danielle wanted to buy baking supplies. Her plan was to stock up on all their favorite homemade treats before the babies arrived next month. She didn't imagine she would have much time to bake with newborn twins in the house. Last week, they'd had a new freezer delivered, which Walt had easily moved to the basement, using his telekinetic gift. Initially, Walt had discouraged Danielle's plan, not wanting her on her feet for that long. She soon explained Marie had offered to help her, which would allow Danielle to remain seated during the process. Walt found Marie's offer generous, as Marie had not been fond of cooking during her lifetime, aside from her legendary Christmas divinity and peanut brittle. He doubted she had developed a love of baking during her death. Just as Walt pulled into the grocery store parking lot, Danielle's cell phone rang. She answered the call. Walt pulled into a parking spot, turned off the ignition, and waited silently for Danielle to finish.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?